In this edition of Synth Sound Design Masterclass with computer music, we're going to be using the G-Force Axxess plugin synthesizer to create a PWM pulsing bass sound. This sound draws inspiration from some of the classic bass sounds that we heard on garage tracks in the 90s, but it also remains a sound which infiltrates large elements of commercial music today, particularly from artists such as Röyksopp and Lindstrom. So load up the G-Force Axxess within your DAW, and the first thing we'll do is perform an initialize. We do this by going to the top of the plugin window, clicking on the preset browser, and coming down to where it says Init Patch on the bottom left-hand side. When we click on this, we'll find ourselves with a wide open filter playing a sawtooth. The front panel design on ARP synthesizers is slightly different from some other models, so in order to adjust our oscillator settings, we need to go to the Audio Mixer section, which is right in the center. The primary tone for our patch is going to be a square wave. This is indicated from the VCO square wave symbol that we have right in the center. Click and hold on the fader and drag it up to a value of approximately -7 dB. As we've said before, it's quite difficult to get the absolute exact values with some of the faders on screen, so don't worry if you're not able to hit the exact number. As long as you're in the right ballpark, your sound should be pretty identical. Let's now adjust the other faders in the Audio Mixer section, beginning with the sawtooth. We do want a little bit of sawtooth color in this sound, so we're going to reduce this fader to a value of approximately -14 dB. We also want a little splash of sub-oscillator, so adjusting the sub fader, set this to a value of approximately -23 dB. If you play your sound now, it should sound like this. You can hear that the sound is particularly bright right now, and this is because the VCF cutoff frequency fader is set to its maximum. In our next step, we're going to reduce this to a value of approximately 110 Hz. If you play your sound now, it'll be pretty dull and virtually inaudible. Next, we're going to adjust the pulse width modulation relating to our square wave. Move across to the left-hand side, and you'll see faders with the description pulse width or pulse width mod. Beginning with the pulse width fader, this is a manual fader that changes the width of modulation of the square wave. We're going to set this to a value of 0.15. Right next door is the LFO modulation fader. This indicates the amount of modulation that will take place. Set this to a value of approximately 36%. Right next door to the pulse width mod section is the LFO section. This allows us to adjust the frequency, or the speed if you prefer, of the LFO. But before we make any adjustments, just check that we're in sync mode. You'll see two circular arrows, which are illuminated in amber. This is the default setting. If for whatever reason these aren't illuminated, just make sure it's switched on. Now when you go to the LFO frequency fader, when you click and hold on it, you should see numbers relating to subdivision of beat. We're going to set this fader to a value of half beats. If you play your sound at the moment, it's still going to sound very, very dull. In fact, the last stage that we just did with pulse width modulation, you'll barely be able to hear. All that's going to change in the next couple of steps. We're going to apply a modulation from the XADSR section, which is at the top of the plugin window, toward the filter. The method for applying a modulation routing is the same for all parameters. The only difference is you select the parameter you wish to apply the routing to. We want to apply a modulation routing in the direction of the voltage-controlled filter frequency fader. This is also known as the cutoff frequency fader. Click on VCF Freak at the top, and you should see that the fader becomes bracketed in blue. This means it's ready to accept a modulation. Then move to the top of the plugin window, to the XADSR section, and you will see that VCF cutoff has now appeared in the display window. We're going to make 3 adjustments, beginning with the decay fader, which we're going to set to a value of 0.36 seconds. The envelopes in this section are very snappy, hence the degree of detail, but as long as you're in the ballpark of 0.36, it should sound fine. Then move to the release fader and make a similar adjustment to a value of 0.14 seconds. If you play your sound now, you'll notice it still sounds the same. This is because we haven't indicated the amount of XADSR envelope which is heading towards the VCF frequency cutoff fader. The amount is indicated by the amplitude pot. Click and hold on this pot and drag it up to a value of 65%. Now when you play your sound, you'll hear a real bite to the brightness of the sound at the beginning of each attack. That concludes the main nuts and bolts of our sound, but there are a couple of other minor settings that we ought to put in place. First of all, Go to the polyphony section, which is on the bottom right-hand corner of the plugin window. You'll notice that we're currently set to legato mode. This is fine if you want to create glides between notes, but we're going to switch to mono mode, which means that we don't get any gliding. Which of these settings you choose to use is really dependent on your production. Then we're going to move to the top of the plugin window to the distortion section. We turn the distortion on by clicking on the little light which is currently switched off. When you click on it, it will display green. Then turn the gain of the distortion up to a value of approximately 32%. You can experiment with the tonal colour of the distortion, but we like something which is a little bit on the darker side, so we're going to reduce it to a value of around 21%. Finally, this is the exact sort of sound that will benefit very heavily from some compression. You can use any compressor you like, but certain compressors lend themselves more to the sort of tone that we want to create. We're using the Universal Audio 1176 compressor, which is particularly quick off the mark when it comes to applying the compression. Couple this with the Universal Audio LA2 compressor and you get a perfect pairing which really warms up those low bass register tones.